Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed architects and all honored guests, welcome to the second day of ASA International Forum 2024 here at the Architect 24 Expo. How is your morning? Was anyone also here for the yesterday sessions? Yay, I see so many people, and I believe many of you here have registered to all of our 6 sessions already. Thank you very much for joining. For today, we will explore deeper to the architectural language under the theme Critical Regionalism in Architecture from our Thai and international architects, as well as from many architectural projects. I'm Prawat Thampitak. I'm honored to be your MC for today. Yesterday, we have gone through 3 exceptional sessions from our honored speakers, which are Marina Tabrasam, the principal architect of Marina Tabrasam Architects from Bangladesh, Ongtuan Chaya, a partner of Renzo Pino Building Workshop from France, and Dalena and Florin, co-founders of Chow from Indonesia. We have learned from our 3 sessions that it's crucial to design the architecture in harmony with the surroundings, include the context, direct context, and indirect context, as well as the sustainability. Architects don't just create buildings, but they also craft meaningful structure from using materials as well as the abstract elements. And for today, we are also packed with fruitful topics from our 3 honored speakers, which are Erik L'Heureux, Dean's Chair Associate Professor of the National University of Singapore, Thong Panin, founding principal of Research Studio Panin from Thailand, and Mai Yen Song, founder and principal partner of NAT Architects. Now it's time. Are you all ready? Let's start the first session of the day with the topic of hot air decarbonization on the Equator by Erik L'Heureux, Dean's Chair Associate Professor of the National University of Singapore. If you are ready, please join me to welcome our honored speakers.
Thank you. I'm Erik L'Heureux. I was just mentioned a Dean's Chair Associate Professor from the National University of Singapore. I like to say that I'm a full-time academic with a stressful hobby, and that's doing some practice. I'm going to read a little bit from my notes, so let me just pull this up just to begin. Of course it went. So first let me say that I'm delighted to be here in Bangkok, and thanks to the Association of Siamese Architects, especially Chuta Sintapan, who extended this invitation to be a part of a great list of speakers. The last time I saw Chuta, we were chatting about this yesterday, was at his wedding sometime in the early 2000s, so it's been 2 decades already. We've both gotten a little bit older, a little grayer, maybe even a little fatter. Anyway, it's a delight to see him right in front. I'm also excited that Chatpong Charundi Mall from Chat Architects is moderating this session. I've had the pleasure to invite Chat to NUS, where he taught at the end of the pandemic, and also get to know him and your delightful practice. It's really quite amazing, so thank you for doing that. There's also so many friends and colleagues in the audience. I really appreciate you coming out on a Sunday morning for that. So hot air, decarbonization on the equator, is a story where I've pushed for the integration of design and decarbonization in adaptive reuse projects in Singapore, embracing the tropical climate and our shared carbon legacy that is unique to this part of the world. I'm only going to show 2 institutional projects with a deep dive into one. Sometimes it will feel a little bit like a designy presentation with pretty pictures and positive narratives, as these things usually are. And at other times it will feel a bit technical and numerically driven, so bear with me if you begin to haze over. Let me first begin by saying that I was surprised to see that I was to speak under the title Collective Language, Critical Regionalism in Architecture. Not only because critical regionalism seems a bit old, but that I never imagined that I was a critical regionalist at heart. after doing this deck and reflecting a bit further, the hot air of the equator maybe has seeped into my being, and in some ways that I have become a critical regionalist. So I want to thank Chuta for putting me in this camp. As you all know, critical regionalism was first framed in 1981 by Zanis and Lefebvre, and then Frampton in his famed Towards a Critical Regionalism, 6 Points for an Architecture of Resistance, that was published in 1983. That was at a time when I was only 10 years old, making tree forts in some New England countryside. When I came to Singapore from my cool climate background about 20 years ago, I was surprised to see critical regionalism alive and well. It was at most a peripheral concern in New York, architecture circles from where I came, but in Singapore represented a foundation of practice, a decolonial sensibility, even if it was crafted by a bunch of people from the global north. And somehow, today, 40 years later, we're talking about this unfinished project and how it might be inspirational for practice. What critical regionalism attempted to do was to resist the universalizing aspects of global architecture, returning climate and the specifics of regional production into the expression of design. But in many ways, critical regionalism has largely failed. Most urban downtowns in ASEAN are filled with air-conditioned glass boxes, built in and from a fossil fuel economy, where concrete frames and glazing envelopes are powered by prodigious amounts of air conditioning. Yes, there are many examples of good critical regional architecture. You should all go check out the ASA Asian Contemporary Architecture exhibition just upstairs. But those examples are largely in a minority. Singapore's architectural scene, as this image indicates, and much of the developing tropics today, and Bangkok is maybe included on this list, is entirely dependent not only on fossil fuel symbols of air conditioning, glass curtain walls and enclosed synthetic environments, but more precisely on an entire mindset of the eradication of the tropical. We see similar aspirations in Ho Chi Minh City, where I was just last week, where glass-wrapped Landmark 81 spends even more fossil fuels to light it up at night. Or Jakarta, where global aspirations are reflected in the envelopes of air-conditioned central business district. Or here in Bangkok, where a pixelated glass tower climbs over their heavier and more opaque brethren from generations earlier. Where we do see critical regionalism look like its success is in the privileged areas of our cities where wealthy bungalows are pruned and maintained by an army of workers, and where open living and dining rooms close at the touch of a button, transformed into their own air-conditioned bubbles. Where Singapore houses of 1,000 square meters or more, that's 10,000 square feet and above for my American friends, seems small and diminutive even for these crazy rich Asians. For as much as I appreciate the architecture and how difficult it is to make it, it's a symbol of tropical living with a critical regionalist aesthetic for the privileged very few. But there is another history of critical regionalism, a history of architecture that existed before the term was even invented. At that golden moment when architecture on the equator was just beginning to wrestle with air conditioning and urban density, where passivity and mechanical demands had equal sway, where atmospheric calibration was manifest through materials, not through mechanical conditioning alone. Largely built between the 1950s and the 1970s, we find a robust, concrete, brutal, heavy architecture that is, in my opinion, some of the best architecture in the urban equator. A modernist language adapted to context, prioritizing shade, opacity, and materiality over transparency and dematerialization. These are heavy buildings, opaque, and they belong on the equator, and they are critical regional examples, but designed and built before the term was even invented. Last night I was out with Chat and we saw a few of them when we were driving around downtown Bangkok. Personally, I mine this period for ideas, knowledge, and expertise, building on the shoulders of others who came before me to inspire and suggest a design language for my own work. We find examples throughout Ho Chi Minh City, though they are rapidly being erased, as we find in most high-density developing cities in this part of the world. Examples are in Manila and Jakarta and in India. And I know they're here in Bangkok too. There's a tremendous collection of background, mid-20th century buildings, an amazing architectural inheritance, and for today, a tremendous carbon inheritance too, that works with the hot air of the equator and the urban densities that are integral to ASEAN. These background buildings account for more than 80% of our building stock. The World Green Building Council shows that in Europe, for example, 80% of the buildings already in use will still be around by 2050. This is an amazing opportunity for architects and developers to repurpose, reimagine, and keep all that embodied carbon already within our cities locked in. And increasingly, this will be the future of Southeast Asia, just as it is for Europe. And let me tell you why. As you've already heard probably numerous times, and I'm sure it was expressed yesterday during the presentations, the building industry accounts for 39% of global CO2 emissions. That's an estimated 15 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. And to put those numbers in a more visceral perspective, borrowing from Juliet Morgan from Gensler, that is 4 in 10 hectares of rainforest destruction are caused by us. 4 in 10 species that are lost to climate change are also on us. And 4 in 10 deaths are due to climate migration. That's us too. So as architects, we have a huge responsibility to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels, to find new symbols of a decarbonized future, and move quickly to minimize our impact. And the heat wave across Southeast Asia that was cooking us all just past the last week, while it's even ironic as it sounds, requires even more fossil fuels to power all that air conditioning for those of us who can afford it. And this is where I'm going to get a little bit nerdy and technical, so bear with me. Of that 39% of CO2, 28% is due to operational carbon, the carbon expended to heat, cool, and light buildings, largely air conditioning in this part of the world, while 11% of is embodied carbon, which is the carbon expended to make buildings. Operational carbon and embodied carbon are intrinsically linked to time. Operational carbon is dispersed over the life of a building, where relatively small emissions accumulate over, let's say, 50 years. In contrast, embodied carbon constitutes a spike of emissions during the short construction period of a building, typically within 2 to 3 years. Embodied carbon is based on present-day design decisions, with an immediate surge of carbon during new construction, whereas operational carbon can benefit from performance improvements and system efficiencies over the building's lifespan. So those little red bars that are going up is when you can imagine the building is getting adapted and new air conditioning systems go in, or lighting systems that require less energy. So consequently, operational carbon efficiency can be enhanced, that's what the little red bars are, while embodied carbon cannot. Embodied carbon represents a significant discharge with each new building constructed. Or to understand it another way, imagine a large bomb of CO2 exploding every time a new building is built. 2 bombs explode each time a building is built when an existing building on a site is demolished to make room for new construction. Multiplied by the number of new buildings and those demolished that are built globally each year, the violent impacts of carbon emissions on our planet's atmosphere becomes visible. And though great effort over the past 2 decades has been put into operational carbon reductions, and there are many examples of this in Bangkok and across Southeast Asia, it is the embodied carbon that is wreaking havoc on our planet right now each time a new building is built. The operational carbon can be mitigated over time, while the embodied carbon cannot, because it is right here, right now, exploding all around us each time we build a new building. So if we can reuse and extend the life of all of those mundane and seemingly crappy mid-century buildings in the foreground and in the sides of this image, we not only help reduce embodied carbon, but reduce our industry's impact on the planet. It's also a critical regional approach to repurpose the buildings that come before us and extend our shared carbon legacy into the future. Now to the pretty pictures. The locking in of all of that embodied carbon from generations earlier is deeply embedded in the design ethos of the adaptive reuse of SDE 1 and 3, the home of the Department of Architecture on the National University of Singapore campus, that I had the privilege to design over 8 years. It just completed and opened last year. The 2 buildings are net zero energy and super low carbon, with an estimated net zero carbon, which is achieving carbon neutrality, in about 35 to 40 years. That means all the embodied carbon that was put into the renovation will be paid off to make them fully carbon neutral. Just as importantly, the design of these buildings look to that fertile period of mid-century modernism as a site for invention and inspiration. Then it's put through a lens of decarbonization to achieve architecture that resurrects the history, the aspirations, and the carbon from earlier generations and extends it to the future. Architects, it might be said, are carbon choreographers and carbon curators. And increasingly crucial in response to our planetary climate crisis, architects must serve as carbon custodians. In our role as carbon curators, we select and specify a desired performance of materials, typically sourced along a wide geography, and then choreograph the resulting carbon form by shaping the material, the color, and the spatial arrangement. In this way, building on a site is also building and unbuilding territories far beyond the building itself, linking geographies of production with geographies of extraction. And I'll speak about more about that in a moment. But more importantly, architects must serve as carbon custodians by attributing value to existing carbon investments created by earlier generations and designing improvements to those investments to extend their life and improve their energy performance. In this way, architects can extend the locked-in carbon embodied in the built environment while minimizing the extractive processes that causes so much environmental and climatic degradation. In my design role for SD1 and 3, I served as a carbon custodian first, then a curator and a choreographer secondly and thirdly. To understanding these different roles requires some context and situating us in the context of the island of Singapore. The projects are where the white arrow is. And to situate us in the history of the NUS campus. The campus was born in the context of the social and political and economic upheaval and protests of the late 1960s, where the idea of a center, a quadrangle, a lawn, an oval, or a square, basically places for large student gathering, was suspect, just as we see occurring in the United States right now with all of the protests on university campuses. Generous, open, and exterior spaces simply don't exist in this Kent Ridge campus plan. And not only could such spaces be seen as a political liability, this was what was going on in the 1960s and 70s, but it's often just too damn hot and humid outside to really enjoy them. The campus plan traverses a large ridge and an extensive topography with branching arms where there is no front door or back door. Rather, one is just part of a networked, interconnected pathways and rooms, a networked campus as a single megastructure rather than a series of public spaces surrounded by buildings. The campus also emerged at a time where technology was gaining momentum and manufacturing in Singapore was taking off. The master plan was designed by the Dutch architect and planner S.J. van Endem with his firm OD 205, establishing the grammar of those interconnected network buildings. The plan conjures images of circuit boards and mechanical systems. You could think of Christopher Alexander notes on the synthesis of form or pattern language even. Or Rainer Banham's The Cover of the Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment. What was important was that the university was to embrace symbols of technology to serve the national aspirations of industrial development. The Department of Architecture is situated at the tail end, where the pink arrow is, of that networked black spine. And the rumor is that because the architects are always seemingly the troublemakers, we were placed immediately adjacent to a large road for easy police access in case we got out of hand. It was an engineering vision, a kit of parts that made the campus appear uniform and regular, communicating ideas of functionality, efficiency, and industrialization. The then Faculty of Architecture was completed in 1977. Air conditioning was installed in the early 1980s, powering visions of comfort for the campus body and ejecting the students and the faculty from the tropical context and thrusting them into the globalized synthetic climate similar to the multinational companies which they were expected to work and serve in. If you squint, the campus could be anywhere in the suburbs of London, New York, or Sydney. Air conditioning towers were symbols of that technological and energy might of Singapore that could transform the campus, the students, and the nation from a third world to a first world in a single generation. And as the founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew asserted, air conditioning was the best invention of the 20th century, making equivalent the tropical world to the temperate one, and so too would its campus be equipped with similar transformational technologies. These symbols of air handlers and mechanical louvers lacked many of the discussions of downstream carbon impacting our world today. Since 2014, the School of Design and Environment is now called the College of Design and Engineering at NUS. We tried to counter those lack of social spaces in the campus plan and the simulated temperate environments by renovating the kind of micro-campus, bringing social and gathering spaces, natural ventilation, and the jungle that was lacking in the original plan to the foreground. 4 buildings composed the effort over the past decade. SD4 to the bottom of the plan was completed in 2019, and SD1 and 3 as the 2 adaptive reuse buildings completed in 2023. And there's a new planned SD2, a net zero carbon adaptive reuse that's kind of, we could say, rounding out the narrative. SD4 was the first part of this story. Designed by Siri Multiply and Surbana Jurong, it set ambitious operational targets, energy targets, and helped build confidence with the university that a net zero energy building was possible for a publicly funded institution in Singapore. It's a new purpose-built building with many tropical niceties, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But SD1 and 3 really has been a trickier endeavor in many ways. The existing mid-century buildings were only 39 years old when the team and I began the renovation in 2015. They were in an ambiguous state, not sufficiently old enough to be considered historically important, not architecturally significant to be conserved outright. So we need to create another set of values to convince the university that decarbonization and careful attention to design would be valuable to the campus and pedagogically critical for the next generation of students within. The pile foundation and the embedded carbon in the structural frame, in a way the campus's carbon legacy, we thought could be artifacts to be repurposed and reworked alongside kind of changing its whole interior configuration. In so doing, the architecture could present a vision of carefully conserving the university's resources by reusing the existing carbon invested in the original campus formation and transforming it for future generations. So in this way, the buildings could be seen as a bank of sorts, a vault, with an embodied carbon deposit that could be transformed as an investment that is valuable and worth extending. The values of reuse and reworking with the existing buildings are kind of seemingly obvious, especially in our age of climate catastrophe. However, they run contrary to a deeply embedded cultural expectation where new buildings underpin a forward-looking nation-building narrative. The change in expectation from nation building, which is nation building anew, to national reuse will be one of the greatest challenges on the campus for architectural practice and the developmental policies of Singapore, and in some ways across Southeast Asia in the decades ahead. The innards of SD 1 and 3 were highly problematic. The original building contained a 4-story stack of unconnected floor plates with a bunch of renovations from the 80s to the 2000s that sealed the envelope, replaced natural ventilation with air conditioning, and prioritized faculty spaces, which are all in the back, so there was, in a way, very little daylight coming into the design studios. It was a fossil fuel world, coated into continuous vinyl floors, plastic laminated doors, mineral acoustic tile ceilings, and galvanized AC ducts, illuminated with artificial lighting. We could say it was a petroplastic aesthetic normalized across the NUS campus, and in many ways was a very poor space to learn how to be an architect from. So the project was originally conceived as a facilities renewal, which means just a one-to-one replacement of air conditioning and lighting and fire safety systems. We started to challenge those diminutive targets and create a new set of design values with aspirations around adaptive reuse and decarbonization, kind of solidified around 8 points. The first was to strengthen the Department of Architecture's identity and clarity with an entrance that would link to a promenade that would traverse all of the design studios into one kind of scenographic experience, and a bunch of review spaces that would circulate around that stair, creating a mixing chamber of movement and circulation, maybe glances and views and exchange, a spectacle in theater similar to the great room of Cons Phillips Exeter's library, or maybe even alluding to the Harrison's designed lobby of the Metropolitan Opera, albeit at NUS, of course, on a much more diminutive scale. And indeed, students used the stair to be seen and to see, creating a social heart for the department that was never there. Just as we find in the social ramps that center the life of the Faculty of Architecture in Artigas' big roof architecture building. Point 3, the mixing chamber is surrounded by student social spaces that link the floor plates and the different learning levels into one promenade. The stair is surrounded by crit spaces and centers the community of the architecture program around the unique learning experiences of reviews, so that display, debate, and exchange are all made public, visible, and accessible. The paneling was digitally designed with Grasshopper scripts and parametrically adjusted to existing site conditions, while illuminating illuminated from the setting sun in the west. The design studios and fabrication occur in public view across the plan of the building. This is a view on level 1 into a workshop space so that it all becomes open and visible. Transforming dark, unventilated, and fire-trapped spaces where students graffitied, if you can just read it on the top of the soffit, "I just want to be a million miles away from here," into something spatially generous, open, ventilated, and daylit, equitable to all the students in our program. This is a view of the same studio mezzanine, once the worst space in the building, now transformed into something, I believe, a little bit better. Though designed predominantly with a recycled mineral-based aesthetic, it works hard to resist the petroplastic environment that was just mentioned in the earlier slides, and maybe even to resist the aesthetics of, we could say, the room that we're in right now. Point 5, utilizing the existing concrete frame and its embedded carbon as a kind of durable, flexible, and maybe inspirational asset that makes apparent the inherited lessons from Le Corbusier's Maison Domino as a fundamental grammar to the architecture, while revealing the interior's volumetric dimension, removing partitions, ceiling assemblies, and plan clutter to allow daylight. We reduced the air conditioning and minimized mechanical system symbols while making the remaining equipment visible as a pedagogical tool that improves the air within the building by deploying a hybrid comfort system that reduces the embodied carbon through fabric ducts, single-layer sprinklers, and the elimination of that generic tiled ceiling. The design embeds the tropical climate, flora and fauna as a main protagonist in the heart of the architecture. And the design finally screens the building from its tropical environment and heat gain by creating a deep veil, which is a brise-soleil of sorts, that is an integrated device that creates a unified expression for the department. The veil unifies the SDE microcampus in its coloration, linking to SDE4, and its filigree and form are similar to resist the individuated and unlinked architectural forms that predominated the campus expansion over the past 2 decades. So in this way, it's a kind of humble background building. I'm just going to show some of the things on the interior. The first design action was to remove, rather than add, an opening the floor plan for cross ventilation. So you can see the design studios were kind of wrapped by faculty offices, and we've removed all of those offices and created cross-ventilated studio spaces, all for our students. Old antiquated systems of air conditioning plenums and mechanical detritus were removed to improve the experience of the volume. By being an archaeologist of sorts, the subtractions add up to almost 25% of the height of the original building, shifting volume from systems to human experience. As in the 2014 Venice Biennale, curated by Coolhouse, we reject the size and complexity of those concealed building systems, returning architecture to the experience of structure, material, and volume over the management of ducts and acoustic tiled ceilings. The 20th century technology was removed and replaced with an earlier and better forms of technology that included experience of space itself. The dome, in this way, I would say, is always more inspirational than the duct. But we're not stuck in the Renaissance either. We use building sensors to monitor the air quality and occupation of the building, driving the hybrid cooling system efficiently and creating better use of our facilities. We monitor the PV energy production on the roof, achieving net positive energy performance. This is over 2022 for SDE1, while calibrating the system so that all the carbon is used only when absolutely necessary. Control achievable all from your iPhone. All of these technologies require tremendous coordination and integration, working with multiple digital twin models to simulate and test. We studied how to ventilate and amplify the potential of the structural frame with careful subtractions, completely rejecting the original student spaces as not only experientially depressing, insular, and claustrophobic, but also wasteful in terms of operational and embodied carbon. With the removal, the spaces have become bright, airy, open, and generously reflecting daylight and driving it indoors. You can see the ceiling here is painted in white on the first bay to increase the daylight penetration off a light shelf, which is at the clear story. With the minimization of mechanical systems, there's 50% less embodied carbon than in traditional AC installation, with a savings of 15 tons of CO2 and saving over 15 kilometers of second-layer sprinkler pipes. Fans represent a change from a cool synthetic comfort culture to a decarbonized tropical one. The approach is that a little sweat is okay, at least at first. In this way, the air becomes visible, present, and felt with fans that in unison provide a healthier indoor air environment and a better experience of the architecture. This hybrid air is supplied at 27 degrees Celsius, pretty warm, from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., and the fans, by elevating the airspeed, provide the bodily comfort, while allowing for natural ventilation after hours when the windows open and the building cross-ventilates. With awning windows in a configuration we see in a homage, in a sense, to Mendes de la Rocha's house in Sao Paulo. Fans become important again, not just thermally, but symbolically as a reference to where we are on the equator. Significant studies were done to evaluate energy consumption, the AC load being almost 3 times that of lighting and equipment. We also tried to maximize after-hour comfort where the hybrid system is not in operation. The hybrid air gives full comfort, and I'm just going to point out the only times where it kind of doesn't give it is between May and July, but after 11 p.m. And that's exactly when our students aren't in the design studio, so it kind of calibrates itself very nicely to the use of the building. The 2023 observed energy use intensity, for those of you who are into those kind of things, is 45 kilowatt hour per meter squared, and 40 kilowatt hour per meter squared for SD3. These are very low numbers. But we're not fanatical. Sometimes air conditioning is okay. For example, when the concentrated thermal load is too high, that would overwhelm the hybrid system. This was an original lecture theater, pretty dingy and depressing, and no one's looking too happy here. The renovated theaters, where the thermal loads are too high to use the hybrid, air conditioning is used judiciously, almost as a kind of acupuncture. The point is to use it efficiently and effectively. Doing more with less is the strategy at hand. On the exterior, an aluminum and mild steel veil encapsulates the western and northern elevations, a material choice as the building foundations couldn't take any additional load. I'm just going to show some pictures of that, contrasting old to new. The envelope has a series of light shelves, so it's really deep kind of plan dimension to provide all of that environmental performance. It's almost 7 meters. You can see the light bouncing off it on the top here. It's also inversely calibrated to the tree canopy, so below the tree canopy it opens up, while above it's more opaque. Some details of that. Some of the scripting that goes behind. While Kahn communicated gravity and decreasing aperture size in the Exeter Library, the veil does the opposite, expressing shade on the top and increasing porosity toward the ground in resonance with the tropical landscape and the equatorial climate. And in the evening registers the efforts of our students in the design studio as an illuminated lantern. Clearly, the renovation, as in all renovations, used some carbon. An additional 1.42 million kg of CO2 was added for SD1, and 2.58 million kg CO2 equivalent was added for SD3. The 5 major elements being aluminum, concrete, steel, photovoltaics, and glass, which comprise almost 85% of the new embodied carbon budget. And why is that important? Because as a comparison, the purpose-built new net zero energy building here, SD4, has an embodied carbon of 670 kilograms CO2 equivalent per meter squared. So the SD1 and 3 is almost 1/3 that of SD4. And it's 1/5 the embodied carbon of what's considered a low carbon building in Singapore as defined by the Building Construction Authority under the Green Mark requirements. To reduce the embodied carbon in a building, even in adaptive reuse, it is critical to understand the entire global material ecosystem. For example, the aluminum of SD1 and 3 constitute the majority of the embodied carbon, 29% and 43%. What's important is that the aluminum from the facade screen on the elevations was sourced from China, while the aluminum on the window assemblies came from Belgium. Taking the average carbon energy intensity factor for China and for Belgium, the same ton of aluminum, so it's the same material but sourced from 2 different places, has over 3 times the amount of embodied carbon coming from China than it does from Belgium because of its energy grid. China's mostly dirty coal, not always, but mostly, while Belgium is natural gas. So the exact same material has radically different carbon impacts. There's a whole bunch of other materials that came from all around the world. Steel came from Turkey, photovoltaics also from China. Some concrete came from Japan and Malaysia, with trace amounts from Vietnam and Uzbekistan. So understanding the energy grid in which a material is fabricated is critical in design decision making. We have found in our calculations that transport is almost negligible, at most 10%. So actually what's really important in this is that if you specify a material, you need to specify where that material is coming from, and ideally from the lowest energy grid, regardless of how far it is around the world. Solar panels are not neutral in the carbon story too. We often think of them as a saving grace, but they have a tremendous amount of embodied carbon. The photovoltaics actually constituted 17% for SD1 and 10% for SD3. These are not small numbers. So it will take almost 3 to 5 years of net energy positive performance to pay off these panels on the roof. So in decarbonization, it's critical to probe each material to understand its impact and its total embodied carbon budget, and intimately understand the supply chain and manufacturing energy budget for each material. The adaptive reuse design was initially intended to repurpose and recycle the existing aluminum sunscreen from the 1970s building. This was what we specified in the design documentation. However, the awarded contractor would not warrant the recycled envelope, and the university was unwilling to assume the risk. In this case, carbon custodianship was trumped by liability concerns. Assuming that 70% of that original facade could be reused, as we had it designed originally, the total embodied carbon would have been reduced by 20%. If recycled content in the new aluminum was specified, it wasn't, so it was virgin aluminum, the respective numbers would have saved about 1,300 tons of CO2 equivalent. We investigated timber and less non-mineral-based materials, but because of fire codes and life safety concerns and maintenance regimes at the university, and the weight that the existing piles could take, it was really aluminum was the only one that was going to make it through. So returning to SDE4, this kind of celebrated net zero energy building will pay off less than 1/2 of its embodied carbon across 40 years of continuous net positive energy. So to achieve carbon neutrality will take 100 years, far beyond the life of the building. So in a way, burdening further future generations. SDE1 will pay off all of its embodied carbon in about 35 years. And SDE3 might take a little bit longer, but we expect carbon neutrality within the building's lifespan, or less than 45 years. If we had recycled that original facade, we would have achieved it in 30 years. And if we recycle the aluminum at the end of the building's lifespan and use carbon avoidance calculations, we could achieve carbon neutrality already all the way down to 4 years. The fundamental takeaway is that, as the architect Anne Lacaton asserts, never demolish, always transform. And what new carbon is added, make its embodied carbon as low as possible. SDE 1 and 3 specifications didn't specify the embodied carbon or the source energy intensity factor for the materials. This was all retroactive accounting. Significant improvements could have been made, and we could have really done a much better, but sometimes it's healthy to go back and look at the projects that you've worked on and kind of find where those spaces could have been made with smarter decisions for your next project. I'm going to just show a few more pretty pictures to come out of Graph Zone, some handrail details, some details between old and new, a nice veranda on the roof for our students, a round room for discussion that peers out to the jungle. There's a jungle with a kind of crown. The courtyard serves as a window to the sky, centering climate as a protagonist in the architecture. This was the pre-renovation photo on the right with a temperate lawn, now filled with something more equatorial. We had removed that air conditioning tower, you can see it right in the center, to create a nice courtyard. Student spaces surround that courtyard, kind of ironically replacing the student gathering in the FAU building with a jungle. And a torqued window that plays on Breuer's window on the Whitney, but again, framing a jungle rather than an urban block. Some more images of that looking out to the front door. The tree canopy mimicked in the drop-off canopy. So while also alluding to the mid-20th century modern motifs that underpin Singapore's architectural landscape. I wish I had the courage to remove the fossil fuel symbols of the parking lot when the front, but that's a battle for the next administration. So carbon custodianship requires creating a value system for the two design methods. One is for architects to establish carbon values on existing buildings and develop design skills to adaptively reuse them, keeping carbon investments from earlier generations in the bank. The second value requires redesigning existing buildings through subtraction with careful and limited additions, reducing the carbon costs for any new material added. To be a good carbon custodian, you need to be a good specification writer. The architecture is not just about decarbonization or critical regionalism or technology or experience. It's the integration of all of the above while being firmly located in a climate of hot air. The original campus plan in 1976 building used technology to replace climate. We bring it in, we hybridize it, and we celebrate the equatorial climate in a way that reduces carbon while improving architectural quality, doing more with less, and subtracting rather than adding, and enhancing the human experience while improving the environment where we live. My hope is that the architectural outcomes look good, feel good, belong on the equator, and most importantly, set the foundation and serve as a protagonist for the next 30 years of decarbonized architectural education in Singapore. It's a critical regional approach that looks to an era before critical regionalism was coined, filtered through carbon custodianship and an arc towards complete decarbonization. I just have a few more minutes, and I'm going to just show one more example. Just hold on. As an extension of the lessons from SD 1 and 3, I've had the privilege to redesign the adaptive reuse for the net zero Yusof Ishak House, this NUS Central Students Commons, which was recently awarded a 2023 Wholesome Prize. So it's exciting to see the lessons from SD 1 and 3 come across the campus. One of the more iconic and idiosyncratic buildings, YIH traverses a large slope. It served as a student center that is the heart of a series of interconnected network buildings, as I showed earlier. It was built at the same time as SDE, with a regular concrete frame, terraced horizontal roof lines, and 6 kind of dramatic arches, typical of that mid-century modern trope. The adaptive reuse was originally designed by another firm. I won't name them for obvious reasons. But they seemed to turn the building into an unsightly, air-conditioned, generic airport terminal from Topeka, Kansas. The president of the university had the foresight to stop the lackluster design, asking my team and I to resurrect this important project for the campus. We returned to the architecture's simple essence, viewing the building as a historical asset filled with symbolic memory and amplifying that 20th century language to express the concrete frame, introduce natural ventilation, and establish net zero energy targets. So we kind of riffed on this robust architectural period, in this case, search experiments with vaults, right, and the gloriously, though very temperately misplaced, New York State Museum from Wallace Harrison from 1976. So in a way, the architecture, extends and amplifies that historical language of YAH, increasing shade and naturally ventilated areas and social spaces while creating a symbolic link to the past while looking towards the future. Primary elevations amplify the dramatics of the horizontal tiering. We add a sunscreen and extend the vaults to create a large, naturally ventilated social space for students. The extensive roof is used for PV energy production, and the design is targeted to be net zero energy once completed. We made simple strategic decisions to maximize cross-ventilation. We used the same hybrid cooling as an SDE, while minimizing air conditioning spaces only to the critical areas. So you can see the blue is only where the air conditioning is used. It's just, again, it's like acupuncture. Large circulation spaces are all cross-ventilated that utilize fans to create comfort and elevated air speeds, while the vault motif repeats as a skylight. Rooms directly open to the atrium and the jungle beyond, while exposing the original concrete frame as an aspirational asset. Simple interior finishes with a touch of color is introduced through the furniture and some murals. The vaults are drawn into the interior and become a dramatic spatial and environmental, might even say thermal straws, not just a decorative motif as in the original structure. The project is under construction, with the structure just revealed in all of its glory. So you can see originally the vaults were only so deep, really a kind of motif, and we are extending them both inwards and outwards to create a great social space for the students. Creating a voluminous interior that just needed to be revealed. The vaults will extend from exterior to interior, linking the large naturally ventilated atrium to the heart of the architecture. These are envelope mock-ups underway. We're adjusting the perforation patterns and fluting profiles. This building structure is largely kept intact, with an estimated 1/5 of the embodied carbon of a newly built structure. Even small decisions can make a big difference. In this case, increasing the perforation size of the total embodied aluminum content reduces it by 30%. Just a small change in perforation pattern has a big impact. And we're pushing to reduce the carbon in the structure too, minimizing steel reinforcements, trying to shave off another 15% in the substructure, and to reduce the redundancy and over-reliance on safety factors that our structural engineers love to have. So a small reduction in steel tonnage has a huge impact on the overall embodied carbon number. Some photos taken just last week. We hope to have the building done early 2025. The design, I hope, is a handsome reworking of the campus that threads the university's history through architecture and tying the university's carbon legacy into the next generation of students, cherishing the carbon deposits of the 1970s while making it relevant for today and tomorrow. The transformation story isn't done. This is SD2, a big roof, mass-engineered timber facility, but this requires another lecture. What I've hoped to show is that decarbonization and net zero energy requires careful reworking of what we have, while situating it and celebrating hot air and the carbon legacies that we share on the equator. This requires a cultural shift from building anew as a symbol of national and regional progress to national and regional reuse as necessary symbols for this century. If you want to read more about it, you can find it in Renovating Carbon, published earlier this year. Apologies for the plug. And my last slide. To conclude, a colleague of mine once said to me that he couldn't tell if my buildings that I've designed were from the 1960s or from today. I took it as a tremendous compliment, symbolic in that I learned from this important period of mid-20th century modernism, a kind of critical regionalist view, and a period of Southeast Asia, trying to have buildings resonate with their context and climate of the equator, while designed through a lens of decarbonization. 7 of these 10 projects on the screen are adaptive reuse projects, which is an ethos that is becoming a significant component for my practice. In the spirit of decarbonization, I hope your practice looks to our amazing and existing building stock in Southeast Asia as a site for tremendous architectural invention and carbon custodianship too. And I hope that these lessons that we make here in Southeast Asia will have a greater impact on the future of our warming world, with decarbonization at its core, one building at a time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Erik L'Heureux, for sharing us technical and inspirational knowledge in the session. And we can see from the talk that building account for 39% of global carbon emission. This really illustrates that we need changes to have more net zero building, decarbonized building, to not only preserve our earth, but also in the end, we would have more pleasant place to live. And now we proceed to our Q&A session, which will be moderated by Mr. Chatpong Chunridimon, Principal of Chat Architects. Please welcome our moderator.
Hello, Erik.
Hi, Chat.
Normally, I've been moderating for close to 20 years, and usually the typical response for a lecture is, Erik, you gave a very inspirational. I'm not going to do that, because that's BS.
Yeah.
Erik, you gave a very meaningful, authentic, and really captivating lecture. And I'm not saying it because I'm your friend. I really felt it. I usually don't say a lot after a lecture, but this is how you do a lecture. Erik was worried about not having many projects, but I can't tell you how refreshing it is for you to delve into just a few projects very deeply, and you made the technical information very, very understandable. I can't tell you how refreshing it is, and it's important for me to say because we have young people in the audience, and it's important for you to know what are meaningful lectures and what aren't. I'll leave it at that. When I was listening, I was supposed to think of questions to ask you, but I was so captivated by your lecture. So it's going to be a stream of thought. And then I think we may have questions later, but I want my questions in now. So many things. Let's start with critical regionalism. An idea when we were in school was kind of a novelty, where the Western world was still interested in kind of fleshing out what the other parts of the world were offering. But now, in 2024, these outlying countries are no longer the fringe. We're kind of a new center. So how do you feel about the word critical regionalism now? Do you listen to it and you cringe a little bit, or is there a new meaning for you in what you're doing?
Everyone can hear me? Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that, Chad. I really appreciate the comments. I think critical regionalism, you can sense maybe at the beginning of my lecture I was a little uncomfortable with it, probably because of my background and also because it feels, maybe like a kind of a global north construct that is being applied to the periphery, just as you mentioned. And I think we can take more confidence and maybe appreciation of the kind of history that we have in this part of the world, even though I'm not originally from here, but spending 2 decades, I guess, gives me a little bit of traction. That there's an amazing amount of architecture and architects really trying to find this way of engaging with the climate, with engaging with the way buildings are built in a way that is very sensitive and appropriate to this part of the world, which would be different than if it was in equatorial South America or in equatorial Africa, right? So I don't really ever use critical regionalism in my own talking about my work, and I don't really use it in teaching with my students. I want students to be aware that, yes, it happened, but I try to kind of avoid it because I think a lot of the history of critical regionalism largely surrounded kind of small-scale houses that basically became a kind of an aesthetic for the very few and the very privileged. So that's why I kind of avoid it. Maybe it makes me feel a little icky.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. I want to talk about your great renovations of the Department of Architecture. Because I was lucky enough to teach there for a semester, I was able to experience the spaces intimately. So we had reviews on these kind of podium steps in the open air, which is really great to have studio reviews outdoors. So on top of the tropicality of the spaces you've created, how do tropical studios or creating spaces like that impact the way you teach studio in a tropical country? Because I think it does make a difference to be sitting in a typical sealed hermetic studio, but when you're in a very beautifully tropically designed space, it should have a bearing on the things that you're designing or the projects that instructors are creating for the students. Could you say something about how the building itself hopefully will impact the way one teaches at NUS?
Yeah. Well, I say a few things. The first is we shouldn't be entirely nostalgic that we're going to have 100% naturally ventilated. We just need a roof, protect from the rain, that everything's okay. Because we know that in urban environments, especially dense urban environments, there are other things that kind of get in the way, like sound levels, noise from trucks or highway traffic. And in SD 1 and 3, there's actually a pretty large, noisy road that connects the port right in front. And so, just to give an example, I taught a design studio where students were looking at renovating the building. That was their task at hand. And many of them said, oh, well, we'll just do all naturally ventilated spaces. Well, I said, fine, great, let's go out and sit in that parking lot, and we'll sit out there for 15 minutes and see if we can have a design studio. And of course it doesn't work because the decibel levels are too high. So that actually is the kind of interesting conundrum where you want to allow the hot air in and to incorporate it and kind of use it inspirationally and aspirationally, but at the same time it's conflicted with all of these other urban forces. And I think that's then becomes our role as architects. Where do we put value, and how do we say, oh, well, maybe the building has to be closed up for certain hours, but then other hours can be open, and sometimes it needs a little touch of air conditioning or touch to drop down the humidity level or have fans, and sometimes you don't need any of that, you just need the fans, or sometimes it's fine. So I think we have a more nuanced understanding rather than a kind of, air conditioning is only bad and naturally ventilation is only good. I think that we can't be so polemical in designing really architecture for the urban environments like in Bangkok or in Singapore.
You said something I wrote down, very important. We need to shift from nation building to national reuse. I think that's so important. Let me say it again. Nation building to national reuse. I think it's important for us to understand that because I think when we finished school 20 years ago, the thing was every architect wanted to build their own new building, right? That's how it was a sign of our success. We'd reached that point. But now I think we realize that things have changed, that you don't gain all this glory by building a new building, but looking around you, especially in Thailand, even before COVID, we were wearing masks because we had 2.5 microdust. And as you showed in your presentation, that came from our hands, right? I want to ask you, in terms of looking at large buildings and high-rises, what do you see the future of that in terms of reuse or adaptability or making new high-rises that are more responsive to climate? And I know WOHA has done some interesting work, but do you have any of your own ideas about how to attack that problem in terms of higher density, high-rises?
Yeah, maybe I break that question into two things, and one is a kind of hope that you're right. When we went to school, it was almost always, you would design a new building to show your kind of architectural prowess, right? I would love at NUS for there to be a moratorium on all and new buildings in the design studio. Like it should only be adaptive reuse. Right. Like that would be a great kind of position in leadership for the school. I don't know if they'll take that, but that would be my dream. In a way that should be the kind of ethos, because national reuse will have to be the way forward. When it comes to larger, but at the same time, especially in Southeast Asia, there's still a tremendous amount of demographic pressure into the city, and so there's, again, a kind of contradiction or conundrum. How do we nationally reuse what we have, but still create spaces for increasing densities, for increasing populations? And I think there will always be some new buildings as part of that mix, right? So rather than new building only, and the past was seen as disposable, somehow we have to create a more, let's say, equal playing field or equitable playing field between those kind of modes. One way to do that is to always try to keep existing buildings in the mix as part of any new development. So, for example, I take my students to Ho Chi Minh for the past 4 years, and they always have to do adaptive reuse and propose a kind of a new build component. And hopefully that gets them thinking in that conversation. When it comes to high-rise buildings, high-rise buildings are a conundrum in themselves because the higher you go, the higher amount of embodied carbon necessarily, the higher amount of operational carbon to run all the systems vertically and to move people. So they become tricky, and I don't have answers, to be honest, for a high-rise tower, both in terms of decarbonization from operational and embodied ways. Of course, we see many examples around mass-engineered timber and using other material systems, and I think that that's gaining some traction. I don't think it's going to solve everything. It's just part of the mix that we have at our disposal. Wuhan, there's many other practices that are looking at that in an interesting way, but I still think a high-rise, it might start from thinking more in a more hybrid way. For instance, maybe it's a concrete frame. Partitions could be very lightweight, or those could be mass-engineered timber or non-mineral aesthetic kind of strategies. So maybe you're not getting down to zero, but you're you're moving the needle in a big way. And I think that we all need to be pushing in that way.
I think I'm going to open up the floor to some questions.
Yeah, I want the first question.
Okay.
Sorry. I'm going to take this. Well, that your presentation was very educational, as academic, very informative, full of really wonderful narratives, wit and sarcasm. When I grow up, I want to be able to present like that. Well, coming back to, we have a lot of young audience here, and I think the importance of narratives and how to tell stories about your architecture is quite important. And throughout the presentation, I see all these, kind of really wonderful comparisons to known works, of famous architects, or a comparison between kind of like the contextual comparison between the historical projects towards what you are doing in your own architecture. I wonder how do you come up with those sort of narratives, and how much of those comparisons are intentional from the beginning? How much of that comparison are actually re-narrated as you have discovered or as the project has been finished?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Chuta, thanks for that question. It's a great one. As you know, and many people who are practicing, architecture is super contingent on all the other factors and characters who are in any kind of building project. So whether it's from the university or the architects of record or the consulting team to the faculty, in these cases because they're institutional buildings, to students, there's all these things happening. So you think you can have a very clear narrative, but it never can go that way. It's a mess. And a lot of times you're operating on the basis of intuition. So maybe I have 20 over years of intuition that I'm working on, but I keep chewing on it. So I'm very fascinated in this period, the 50s to the 70s. So I keep looking at it, and in all my projects, I'm kind of like digging through it. So sometimes it's coming through that intuition and through that own experience. Sometimes it's happening directly, like to produce that kind of jungle courtyard was really, and to shift away from those temperate images or the kind of temperate experience into a really equatorial one was a fundamental ethos from the beginning. Some of the little sarcastic or linkings to history come later, and definitely there's a post rethinking through the project, which I'm completely fine with. I think it doesn't delegitimate the effort, and if I can sometimes, maybe I'm reading a book or I'm on a plane or I see something and I say, oh, somehow that's there. Now, whether it was really intentional or not, or I'm just making it look nice, I don't really care. I mean, it's fine. It's part of the telling of the story of the work. And if that helps communicate some of the values, then all the better.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes.
Yes, okay, I'm a Pisit Royal Avanage. Actually, I'm a NUS faculty alumni, long time ago, at the time of Wong Yun Chi,
Yeah, yes.
Heng Chai Kiang and all
Yes.
that. I would like you to give us a brief picture, of what is going on in terms of architectural education in Singapore, I've heard that they're trying to merge School of Architecture with engineering and merging School of Arts, and science, Okay, I'm not sure whether I heard it rightly or wrongly, but I think that's a big step. And also give us a picture of what is SUTD, is doing as well, compared to what NUS is doing. And I heard that there's another third university, right, that's coming up, which is focusing on urban studies. Okay, can you give us a...
Yeah, I mean, I won't talk too much about SUTD, but I'll talk about NUS. You're right, there's been a kind of university level change to merge a bunch of the faculties. And the kind of inspiration for that, and I think maybe the aspiration of the president, this came from up on high, was to create more cross and interdisciplinary learning for our students, which is seen as important for Singapore and also important for the future. And so the College of Design and Engineering is part of that ethos. I think, we're kind of freshly put together, so the outcomes aren't so visible. But I will just say, maybe from personal reflection, just as in this lecture, when I went to school, when we went to school, it was really a kind of formal and cultural project. Right, so I was really concerned about the way the building looked, and your kind of virtuosity as an architect was how tricked out you could do it, or what kind of narrative you could put behind it. I think definitely in an age of our climate catastrophe, we need to be able to at least get pretty good at the numbers, or at least be aware of what an EUI is. What is a good number for the embodied carbon of your building? What is a good number? Like, to have a sense of what those things are. And as you can see in the deck, 20 years ago, I would have run away from the charts as fast as possible. But I think today we can't. And I think having some of that data and that information helps us make smarter decisions, which are necessary for confronting our warming world. And I think back to NUS, part of those joinings of different faculties is to hope to encourage that, whether it happens formally or informally. At least the students are kind of all mixed up in that. So we get engineering input, we get architectural input and design input. So that's the kind of general ethos. SUTD, that's a different animal. I'll keep that off the table. And the NUS cities, I mean, Singapore, as a kind of urban country, as a nation state, is of course interested in promoting its kind of urban approach, and to promote it and also to learn from, and they do that through many different venues, through the university, but also through government and whatnot.
If I can add on to it, I think it was interesting with the last question tied to Chuta's question about using architectural references and being positively inspired by form making on top of the technical numbers. I think it's very important because at this point, somebody may look at your lecture and take away the technical aspects of it without seeing the beauty of how you've woven these really great theoretical and kind of precedence usage into it. I think design needs both. You need to be an expert at the numbers, not an expert, just able to do it, but also be able to create form in an intelligent way that ties history and current states together. So I think it's important because right now it's definitely either or in studios. So for me, what I took away from your lecture and your ability as an instructor is your ability to touch on both, which I think we need in instructors in architecture school. Yeah. More questions,
totally
please.
agree.
There's one over there.
Thank you for the presentation. I wonder when you mentioned about the cultural shift that we need to achieve, I assume that the users of the buildings really need to have some behavioral shifts as well. As you mentioned in the SD4, the people will be sweat a little, and I believe that it's probably have some restriction on the equipments on the plug load, or like how people can use the appliance as well. How did you get the stakeholder to commit or to agree with this change about their comfort level and also how they normally would use the building?
Mm-hmm.
That's the question.
Yeah, it's a great question. The cultural shift is, we have to take small steps, and we need examples. We need built examples to help make those things happen, to build confidence. So every project that is just pushing the needle a little bit helps build greater confidence. Definitely, the question of air conditioning is an interesting one because, in a way, when I first arrived, and I'll just speak personally, when I first arrived in Singapore and I would go to some of those dingy lecture theaters, it felt like 18 degrees inside, and I would have to wear a jacket, maybe even a sweater inside, and it was almost toxic going from a 30-degree outdoor area into 18 degrees. But air conditioning was a kind of symbol, right, that Singapore had made itself out of the tropics. It didn't have that kind of tropical colonial legacy anymore, that it could be on par with the global north urban environment. And so it was a kind of a symbol of luxury and a symbol of technological might. To start to change and to dig into that was really challenging. When the hybrid system was being developed with Wolfgang Kessling and Transolar and also faculty members at the school, there was actually a lot of pushback from some of our experts in air conditioning. They thought it was ridiculous, right? It was the hardest, actually they were the hardest ones to push. But we did mock-ups and we did rooms as mock-ups, and eventually we got enough currency, and I think also the dean at the time was Hang Chai Kiang, was very instrumental in pushing it through, I think on his will, and said we're going to do that. And then what happened was when the hybrid system was originally an SD4. When the building first opened, the first few months people would complain a lot. It's too hot. It was too hot. And because what happens is people would get off the bus or they'd drive and get out of their car, and they came out of an air-conditioned environment, and then they would have to walk up 3 or 4 flights of stairs or whatever it was, and their metabolism would go up, and they wanted instant cooling. But after we explained the building and explained, just let your metabolism slow down a little bit. Give yourself 10 minutes. Just let it calm down. It's fine. And it's 100% fresh air, so there's no CO2. It's really good indoor air quality. People kind of got it. And now we don't have any complaints. I mean, sometimes the student might complain, the fan doesn't work. But that's fine, we can fix those things. But it was a cultural change, and now we don't hear these complaints anymore. So it just requires, again, those kind of baby steps to get people to start to shift and to say, the building is going to operate in a different way. My expectation of what it's going to do is going to be slightly different, and I just need to let my metabolism settle, and great, we save a bunch of energy, we get better indoor air quality. And I think it's a healthier approach, and it's also an approach that's kind of site-specific to the equator.
I'm going to jump in. I want to ask more questions. So you're an educator as well. So you teach studios. I'm really interested to hear about how you weave in your ideas and your practice into, let's say, your studio prompts. Can you just give us an example of some of the topics of the studios you've taught? Sure. And how that's linked into your ideas towards architecture?
Yeah, I'll give 2 examples. One, I teach in both the undergraduate and in the master's program, and I think when you were teaching alongside me, in the master's program, we always travel to Southeast Asia, so I took students to Ho Chi Minh. We look at mid-century modern projects that are still existing. They have to adaptively reuse them, and then they also have to do a kind of a new addition component. They have to do all the carbon calculations, both operational and embodied carbon. I also have them do all the labor accounting, so they track all their own time and labor into it. And we reflect on the formal outcomes, the performance outcomes, and all these embodied carbon and operational carbon numbers. You know, it's hard to get your head around those things. Just like as an architect, our skill set is around dimensions. Like we should know what 4 meters is, or we should know what a 9-meter structural bay is. Well, we should know that the EUI of this room is probably 350, while a building like SDE is 45. Like we should have that sense, but we don't, because at least our generation wasn't educated in that. So I'm trying to get students at least intuitively familiar with those kinds of reference points. In the undergraduate program, we do something much more intimate. They have to create some kind of weird apparatus that goes between two heads. They create different climates. They measure all of those things. And that eventually turns into an adaptive reuse of a primary school in Singapore. Again, adaptive reuse. And they do carbon accounting of it, but very basic. Like when I say carbon accounting, you know, there's a lot of software out there that gets really technical. We don't need that. What we need is an 80%, we just need the big moves. If you can get 80% kind of registration or 80% precision, you're already doing enough. That's all you need to make those important design decisions. So we're trying, this is the first year in the undergraduate, to get carbon calculations into the curriculum so that when they get into the master's program, it's kind of lingua franca, just like 9-meter structural base should be.
I think that's so important because practicing architects and educators, sometimes we just glance over and we throw the words sustainability and green, and then we pick some examples from the internet with a green roof or a green facade, and then we tell our students to kind of do something like that. So what you suggested is so important, is just to have this basic understanding of a few of the numbers, and so it'll actually change the way we design, because it won't just be formulaic.
Yes.
You'll actually be responding to many things. Any other questions? One more in the back.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. During your lecture, I wonder about comparison of the materials for building envelope, and then you answered yourself about wood, right? Because when you mention embodied carbon, these days there are examples of building in Australia or in Europe that they kind of go back to using wood, even for tall buildings. So I'm wondering how you see the change in the future, how that would be possible, especially in the context of hot, humid climate.
Yeah, it's a great question. I definitely think wood has to be part of the material mix, and we need to start to pivot away from kind of mineral-based extractive materials. Wood is also extractive in a way. And you know, a lot of the wood that we see in traditional architecture in this part of the world, or at least in the case of Singapore, has been depleted to such a degree that the kind of species that would resist would resist insects are really no longer available, or at such an extremely high price that it's not easily kind of applicable. So what happens is then we're importing mass-engineered timber from Austria or other places around the world. I think that's part of the mix. I think there's some challenges there. I think, excuse me, I think wood has to be done in an appropriate way. I think there's also change that needs to occur in the fire regulations, right? So that's like one of the challenges in Singapore, though they're making good strides at that, is around mass-engineered timber and how to handle buildings, tall buildings in dense urban environments, and what the fire regulations are around that. So there's some kind of special one-off cases. In the adaptive reuse of SD1 and 3, we looked at it at that time, and this was 2015, 2016, and it was seen as too difficult to get through, and that's why we originally thought recycling that aluminum was the right strategy. rather than going to kind of replace it with timber. Even today, I think as an institutional building, timber would not be allowed, at least in the existing code. So there would probably have to be through a whole series of waivers, and maybe today I would have pushed a lot harder than I did in 2015, 2016. So I would say it's just more as an encouragement. It will have to be part of our architectural mix.
Thank you.
Any other questions? We may take one more because we're running out of time. One more over there.
Hello, Erik. Thank you for a seriously thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. I agree with Chad's observation earlier about a great mix between the theoretical precedents and the technical side of your talk. But then let's go back a little to the slightly technical side of it. You were mentioning all the way that this is the hot climate, but then we all know that what's really bugging us around here is also the muggy, the humidity side of it. So I'm wondering, how does rain and humidity factor in your design decisions with for example, SD1 and 3?
Yeah, super important question. Humidity, of course, is part of the kind of environmental mix which creates conditions for comfort or discomfort, right? And I think what we tried to do in SD1 and 3 was to separate the notion that temperature alone creates comfort. So it doesn't. So the hybrid system, as I said, 27 degrees, it's dehumidifying the air. So it's going from 80% humidity to about 60% humidity. So it's making it a little bit drier. And then using elevated airspeed to provide that comfort during the kind of operational hours of the building. But what happens is by kind of cooling the inside of the building, there's a thermal lag. So the concrete, everything that's in there, the existing structure, there's a thermal lag that kind of drags into the evening. So when the hybrid system shuts down at 6 or 6:30, the air still is pretty comfortable till about 8:30. Then the fans still keep working. Then the windows can, the students can open up the windows. You cross-ventilate. And then, maybe by 11 or 12 at night, of course, we're not getting the solar load, so the air temperature is usually a little bit cooler, maybe more humid, but it's fine. And then eventually, when it gets, too uncomfortable, they should be going home anyway to sleep, or at least we hope so, right? So there's a kind of calibration in the way that the building can kind of open and close and modulate and adjust to do that. In terms of rain, we didn't do a lot of rain harvesting for SD1 and 3. I wish we had, but it wasn't in the budget. But I would encourage that for any building that should be, as much as possible, 100% using the resource which is there to flush all the toilets, to even create potable water if possible. And of course, in this part of the world, we have plentiful amounts of rain, usually. In Singapore, it's like 2.4 meters, I think, annually per year. In some of my other projects, I use it expressively, right? Also as a kind of formal thing, but also one of the things in Singapore, and maybe it's here in Bangkok too, when it does rain, there's a lot of soot in the atmosphere. It's also because we have big oil refineries nearby, but there's also a lot of soot from the automobile traffic, and so the rain has a tendency to stain the buildings. That can be used positively, like if you control it and manage it, maybe the staining is good. Maybe it's horrible and you have to manage it in another way to keep the building looking clean. Again, back to cultural expectations on whether a building should look clean or slightly patinaed. That's a different conversation. But I think that there's ways that it can be done, and there's other projects that I could show, but that's another lecture on its own.
I propose ASA should sponsor a trip for our instructors to NUS. Seriously, I think it would be very beneficial, because being inside and talking about are two different things. I propose being inside and proving
Yes.
our
absolutely.
theories. Thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erik L'Heureux, our esteemed speaker, and Mr. Chatpong Chirnridimon, our moderator for the Q&A session. This is a beneficial session for all of us to discuss and share deeper in details with our speaker and our moderator. On this occasion, I would like to invite Mr. Chutiyawe Sintupan, our chairman of ASA Expo 2024, to give a souvenir to our honored speakers. This session really inspired and sparked new ideas to all of us here. Many architectural projects that we have learned throughout the lecture. At the same time, our speaker Erik L'Heureux also has special souvenir to ASA, the Association of Siamese Architects under Royal Patronage. At this moment, it will be group photo session, so we would like to invite our moderator to join the group photo session as well. And this is the fourth session of the forum. Please give a big round of applause to our speaker. Thank you very much everyone for the group photo session. Before the break, I would like to share the announcement regarding the session schedule of Ma Yen-song. The session time has been moved to 3:30 p.m. The session of Ma Yen-song has been moved to 3:30 p.m. So it will be right after Ton Khao Panin session. Stay tuned for that. And now we will have a break. Next section will be resumed at 2 p.m. It will be the session of Ton Khao Panin, founding principal of Research Studio Panin from Thailand, on the topic of basic elements. And we also encourage everyone to join us on the second floor. We have Architect 24 Expo. You would love it and you will find some inspiration there as well. Right now, enjoy your break, have a good lunch, and we'll see you soon at 2 p.m. Thank you very much.